I had been driving for hours, miles from the nearest town, the endless road stretching out in front of me like a dark, unyielding ribbon. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a constant companion in the silent, desolate night. The wind outside whistled through the cracks in the cab, a lonely, haunting melody that only added to the isolation. It was almost midnight, and fatigue was creeping up on me, making my eyelids heavy, my grip on the steering wheel slacken. The monotony of the drive was broken only by the occasional set of headlights passing by, the brief flashes of light that would illuminate the darkness, then disappear, leaving me alone again. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:58 p.m. Just a few more hours and I could pull over, catch a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. My eyes darted to the fuel gauge, hovering just above empty. I'd have to find a place to refuel soon, but for now, I just kept driving, hoping the rhythmic thrum of the engine would keep me awake. That's when I saw him. At first it was just a dark shape, barely visible in the distance, standing by the side of the road. As I got closer, the shape became clearer. A figure, a man, tall and thin, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the moon. My foot eased off the gas, my heart beginning to race as a sense of unease washed over me. I don't know why, but there was something wrong about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As my truck rumbled closer, I could see him more clearly. He was wearing dark, tattered clothes that flapped slightly in the wind. And his face, God, his face. It was pale, almost ghostly, with a skin that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. But it was the eyes that got me. Dark, hollow, like two empty pits staring straight at me, unblinking, expressionless. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I fought the urge to look away. I was still far enough away to turn around, to just keep driving and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something about him drew me in, like I was compelled to get closer, to see him more clearly. And then just as I was close enough to make out the sharp lines of his face, he turned. Slowly, almost deliberately, he turned his head and locked eyes with me. For a moment I felt like time had stopped, like everything around me had gone still and silent. It was just me and him, and those eyes, those dark, empty eyes that seemed to see right through me. I don't know how long I stared, but it felt like an eternity, like I was trapped in that gaze, unable to look away. Then, in an instant, the spell was broken. I jerked the wheel to the side, swerving slightly to put some distance between myself and the figure. My heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I glanced back in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him still standing there, watching me with that eerie, unsettling gaze. But he was gone, vanished. There was no trace of him, no shadow, no movement, just the empty, dark road stretching out behind me. I forced myself to breathe, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I told myself. A figment of my imagination, brought on by the exhaustion, the endless hours of driving. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't something my tired mind had conjured up. There was something out there, something real, and it had seen me. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corners of my eyes made my heart skip a beat. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see that figure standing behind me, watching, waiting. But the road remained empty, the darkness unbroken. It wasn't until I saw the faint glow of a rest stop sign in the distance that I finally felt a glimmer of relief. I pulled in, the tires crunching on the gravel as I brought the truck to a stop. The rest stop was deserted, just a few flickering lights casting pale, sickly pools of illumination on the ground. I stepped out of the truck, the cool night air hitting my skin, and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. I walked around to the back of the trailer, more out of habit than anything else, checking to make sure everything was secure. As I turned to head back to the cab, something caught my eye. There, in the dirt, just a few feet from the back of my truck, was a footprint, a single solitary footprint, large and oddly shaped, the tread unfamiliar. I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. It was too big to be mine, and there was no way anyone else could have been out here. The rest stop was empty, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. But there it was, clear as day, pressed into the dirt like a mark, a sign. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly climbed back into the truck, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't bother to check the mirrors this time. I didn't want to see what might be there, lurking just out of sight. I started the engine, the familiar rumble somewhat comforting, and pulled back onto the road. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first faint rays of dawn cutting through the darkness, but it did nothing to ease the fear twisting in my gut. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, keeping pace, just out of sight. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I half expected to see that figure, those dark, empty eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the endless road, the desolate landscape, and the faint glow of the approaching dawn. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually the sun rose, and the fear that had gripped my heart began to fade, replaced by a dull, numb exhaustion. I found another rest stop, this one busier, with cars and trucks parked haphazardly, drivers stretching their legs, grabbing coffee, chatting with each other. It felt almost normal, like a return to reality after a long, terrible nightmare. But as I stepped out of the truck and glanced down at the dusty ground, my heart froze. There, next to my tire, was another footprint, the same as before, large and unfamiliar. And this time, there was more than one. A trail of them, leading away from the truck, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the rest stop. I wanted to turn around, to get back in the truck and drive, keep driving, until I couldn't anymore. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever it was, it had found me once, and it would find me again. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not alone out here, and I'm not sure I ever will be again. That night was one of the worst storms I'd ever driven through. The kind of storm that makes you feel like you're the only soul left in the world, just you, and the endless miles of asphalt stretching out ahead. The rain was coming down so hard, it was like driving underwater. My wipers were on full blast, but they barely made a difference. Every now and then the lightning would flash, lighting up the highway just enough for me to see the road disappearing into the darkness, and then everything would go black again. I'd been on the road for hours, my back aching, my eyes burning from fatigue. I was just about ready to call it quits when I saw the glow of a rest stop sign cutting through the downpour. It was like a lifeline. I didn't think twice. I took the exit and pulled into the parking lot. There were only a few other vehicles scattered around, mostly trucks like mine. The place had that eerie quiet you only get at 3 in the morning, the kind that makes every creak and groan sound like a scream. I parked as close to the entrance as I could and dashed out into the rain. The wind was like a slap to the face, icy and unrelenting, and the rain soaked through my jacket in seconds. I practically threw myself through the doors, relieved to be out of the storm. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing like they were struggling to stay on. The air was warm, thick with the smell of stale coffee and something else. a smell I couldn't quite place. It was sweet, almost sickly. There were a few people inside. 2 truckers were slumped over their coffee cups at a booth, barely glancing up as I walked by. A family sat huddled around a table, the parents looking tired and worn out, while the kids played with their food. But even though the place wasn't empty, it felt off. Like the kind of place where people disappear and no one notices. I headed straight for the restroom. I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open, and I figured I'd splash some water on my face before grabbing a cup of coffee. As I walked down the dimly lit corridor to the bathroom, my footsteps echoed louder than they should have, bouncing off the walls in a way that made my skin crawl. The restroom door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the lights were flickering worse than out in the main area, casting these weird, jagged shadows across the walls. It was empty, but there was that same sweet, cloying smell, stronger than before. I did my business as fast as I could, my heart starting to beat a little faster, for no reason I could explain. I was at the sink, washing my hands, when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, in the mirror, something moved behind me. I turned around so fast I almost slipped on the wet floor. But there was nothing there. Just the same empty bathroom, the same flickering lights. I shook it off, told myself I was just seeing things because I was so tired. But I didn't waste any time getting out of there. Back in the main area, I went to the counter and ordered a cup of coffee. I stood there, waiting, watching the machine sputter and hiss. I glanced around, looking at the people in the rest stop. They were all still there, but none of them were talking. None of them were even looking up. It was like they were frozen in place. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. Then I saw it again. I was looking at the glass display case in front of me, the one filled with sandwiches that had probably been sitting there all day. In the reflection, there was a figure standing right behind me. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long limbs that looked like they didn't have any joints. It was draped in this dark, tattered coat that seemed to absorb the light around it. But it was the face that made my blood turn to ice. It was a skull, grinning at me with these empty, dark sockets where its eyes should have been. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. The rest stop was silent, except for the buzz of the lights and the distant rumble of thunder outside. I didn't wait for the coffee. I backed away from the counter, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my keys. I was about to make a run for the door when I caught sight of the family again. They were still sitting there, but they weren't moving, not even a twitch. The parents' eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but their faces were blank like mannequins. The kids had stopped playing. They were just sitting there, hands on the table, staring at nothing. I felt sick. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and bolted for the door, not caring if anyone was watching, not caring about anything except getting back to my truck. I burst out into the rain, which had only gotten worse, sheets of water coming down so hard I could barely see. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, picked them up with trembling hands, and finally managed to get the door open. I climbed inside, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. I sat there for a minute, breathing hard, trying to calm down. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired, that I'd had too much caffeine. But I didn't believe it. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the rest stop one last time. And there it was, standing right at the window, staring out at me through the rain. That same skeletal face, its grin wider than ever, pressed up against the glass. I don't know how I managed to keep driving. I don't remember anything after that, not until I saw the first signs of daylight on the horizon. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and even then I barely slept, too scared to close my eyes, too scared that if I did, I'd see that face again. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something worse, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never stopping at that rest stop again. The open road has always been my escape, a place where I could let my mind drift and my worries fade into the hum of my engine. I've spent more nights on the highway than I can count, crisscrossing the country mile after mile, with nothing but my truck and the dark, empty stretches of asphalt for company. It was comforting, in a way. You learn to enjoy the solitude, the feeling that the rest of the world has fallen away, leaving you alone in the dark, moving forward with nothing but the stars and the moon as witnesses. But that night was different. There was something off. I felt it as soon as I merged onto the highway, the way the air seemed heavier, thicker. The road was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind a shroud of clouds, casting the night in an almost unnatural blackness, the kind of dark where even your high beams barely cut through. I'd been driving for hours, but instead of the usual peace, there was an edge to the silence, a tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't think much of it at first. The mind can play tricks on you when you're out there alone, and I was used to it. Just keep your eyes on the road, keep your head clear, and you'll be fine. But then I saw it, a flicker of movement in my rear-view mirror, just for a moment, like a flash of light. I glanced back, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out behind me, disappearing into the dark. I figured it was a trick of the light, maybe the reflection of my own headlights bouncing off a sign or something. I shook my head, trying to push the unease away, but I couldn't shake it. As I drove on, the feeling of being watched, of something creeping up behind me, grew stronger. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see the headlights of a car or a truck, but every time there was nothing. Just the road, empty and endless. I turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the silence, but it didn't help. The static just made it worse, like there was something hiding in the white noise, wetty whispering just out of earshot. And then out of nowhere the headlights appeared, a pair of bright, blinding lights, growing larger and larger as they approached. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly checked my speed, making sure I wasn't going too slow. But the vehicle behind me wasn't slowing down. It was gaining on me, fast. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep calm. Maybe it was just another trucker in a hurry, I told myself. Someone trying to get to their destination before dawn. But there was something about the way the lights moved, the way they swayed slightly from side to side, that didn't sit right. I could feel my pulse quicken, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I didn't want to think about it, but the word slipped into my mind anyway. Predatory. I sped up, trying to put some distance between me and the vehicle, but the lights stayed with me, matching my speed. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass, but they didn't. They just lingered there, hanging back, like they were waiting for something. I tried the CB radio, hoping to get a response from another driver, but all I got was static. That damn unending static. I glanced at the mirror again, and this time I could see the vehicle more clearly. It was a large, dark SUV, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. It didn't have any markings, no logos, nothing to indicate who might be driving it. Just a big, black, faceless shape. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I'd seen cars like that before, usually in movies, the kind that followed people without being noticed, blending into the shadows. I tried to shake it off, but the SUV didn't make it easy. Every time I changed lanes, it followed, moving in perfect sync. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. I tried everything I could think of to lose it, but nothing worked. It was like the damn thing was reading my mind, anticipating my every move. Panic was starting to set in. I could feel it tightening in my chest, making it harder to breathe. I wanted to pull over, get out, and confront whoever was behind the wheel. But something told me that would be a mistake. There was something about the way the SUV moved, the way it seemed to glide across the asphalt, that made my skin crawl. I had the sickening feeling that if I stopped, I wouldn't be driving away again. Then, something changed. The SUV moved closer, pulling up alongside my truck, and I got my first real look at it. For a moment, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I stared, I realized I wasn't imagining it. The SUV was changing. The sleek, angular lines of its body were warping, stretching, as if it were made of liquid. It was bending, twisting, almost like it was growing. I slammed on the brakes, hoping to get away, but the SUV braked with me, its tires screeching. It was so close now, I could see the shape of its headlights reflecting in my side mirror. Two glowing, almost hypnotic eyes. They seemed to pulse, growing brighter and dimmer, like they were breathing. And then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the screech of tires. It was a low, guttural growl, like an animal, like something hungry. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, the engine screaming as I forced the truck to its limit. The SUV stayed with me, its headlights burning into my back. But now there was something else, something more than just the lights. I could see shapes moving in the darkness around the SUV, twisting and writhing like shadows. They flickered in and out of the headlights, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces, grinning, distorted faces with eyes that glowed red, staring at me, mocking me. I didn't know what to do. All I could think was to keep driving, to outrun whatever was behind me. But no matter how fast I went, no matter how many turns I took, the SUV was there, like it was tethered to me. I was trapped, and I knew it. And the worst part, the SUV wasn't just following me anymore, it was hunting me. I can't tell you how long it went on like that, but eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking, my vision was blurring, and I felt like I was about to pass out. I took one last, desperate glance in the mirror, and that's when I saw it. The SUV was gone. Just gone. One moment, it was there, and the next, the road behind me was empty, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, until I could see the world around me again, and the night had lost its hold. But even now, when I'm out there on the road, I can't help but check the mirror, waiting for those lights to appear, waiting for that feeling to return, because I know deep down that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting.